All right, great, thanks. Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Chris Mungall. I'm a computational scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm in the Environmental Genomics and Systems Biology division. A lot of my research involves these days making use of AI, agentic AI, to help build scientific workflows to explore complex environmental omics data. But for a long time, I've worked as part of the general NIH and ontologies and knowledge base community, helping build some of the tools and frameworks that many of us are using for building ontologies and knowledge bases. So I wanted to just give a kind of overview of some of the work that we have been doing on kind of essentially building less tools, but more general patterns for applying agentic AI to semantic curation writ large. And if we've got time, I'll maybe talk a little bit about some work we're doing with kind of like building up kind of like the framework for and a co-scientist to help with environmental research. But a lot of my work is more coming from the biological end of biological and environmental research. Within the division that I'm in, we're very interested in the role that genes and genomes play in controlling a number of different systems, like looking at things from scales right the way through to how genes encode proteins and other regulatory elements in the genomes, giving rise to molecular interactions, cellular functions, all the way up to how this impacts microbial communities or microbial, plant, fungal communities, and indeed all the way through to broader ecosystems. And a lot of what we do in this kind of like biological side of the environmental sciences can be thought of as kind of building wiring diagrams. Essentially, this might be wiring diagrams for how genomes are organized into genes and other regulatory elements, or how the different enzymes that are encoded by genes work together as part of larger metabolic networks, or indeed right the way up through to kind of ecochemical networks and so on. And so a lot of what the work that we do has historically involved manual curation of knowledge from structured and semi-structured sources, primarily the literature. What this has looked like in the past has essentially been developers of ontologies and knowledge-based developers sitting down with specialized tools like Protege, which I think all of us on this call are familiar with. Comes out, of course, from the Stanford group. Thank you, John. And a lot of what we do is aimed towards building these computable semantic representations of our scientific domains. But more increasingly, it's about how we can make use of these to essentially kind of like drive AI, how we can use some of this to give some additional context to big foundational models, whether it's kind of like foundational genome models or earth science models or anything else like that. So one of the reasons I'm here today is I'm sure many of us have come up with the same question, especially starting with the advent of ChatGPT towards the end of 2022 or whenever it was, which is, the question of really, can AI help us, and can agentic AI help us with development of some of these ontologies and knowledge bases? And I think many of us tried this back in the early days of ChatGPT, where we had tried something that we now think of as maybe the LLM as Oracle pattern. And the basic idea here is you just go into your standard kind of like direct LLM interface, maybe like a chat interface, and you ask it to do something like create a term or create a mini ontology for some kind of like concept. So here I'm asking it for to create a term in the plant trait ontology for representing the concept of fine root carbon to leaf carbon ratio. And I think many of us were, maybe somewhat impressed when we first tried tasks like this, because it was able to convincingly make ontologies or bits of ontologies, even using the right syntax. I'm showing you something here in obo syntax. You might not be familiar with it. It's a commonly used ontology syntax in the bio-ontology world. But of course, many of us tried the same experiment and had it spit out syntactically correct RDF XML or Turtle or what have you and so on. But on closer examination, when we looked at some of the results, we would see it would do things like, especially where you have opaque IDs, like in the biosciences, in the bioscience ontologies, it would frequently just hallucinate IDs or even hallucinate parent terms in the ontology that might hypothetically be a good term, but doesn't actually exist in the ontology. So I think, yeah, many of us tried this and were initially excited, and then were maybe a little disappointed when we thought about the practicalities of really integrating this into some of the systems that we have at the moment. But fast forward to now, we're almost at the end of 2025, and this is my super simplistic history of AI. For those of you that know me, know that actually I care deeply about some of these generative AI methodologies, kind of good old-fashioned AI. I love things like rule-based systems and some semantic reasoners and so on. And for simplicity, I'm just kind of relegating them to kind of like pre-LLMs on the left-hand side of the spectrum. But as we'll see later, these kinds of methods actually are increasingly relevant in the age of generative AI. And so, as I said, many of us tried the initial kind of like LLMs for many of these semantic tasks. We were faced with things like hallucinations. Many of us then tried approaches like retrieval augmented generation, which mitigated some of those hallucinations, but were still fairly limited in what they can do. But now fast forward, and again, the concept of agentic AI has really been with us since the early days of AI back, maybe 1980s, maybe before. But I think it's really with some of the latest kind of reasoner models that we're able to really start to make use of agentic AI for semantic tasks. But just to kind of like really orient us with what we mean by agentic AI here, there are many different definitions of it out there on the web that you can argue about. But I like just this very simple definition that an agentic system is basically a while loop that will sit there iterating until some user-specified task is complete. It makes use of a large language model to both to devise the initial plan and to execute that plan. And that plan is typically executed by having the LLM decide which tools to call. And these tools may be wrapped in the model context protocol, or there's other ways of using these tools as well. But essentially, it's just a software system that runs in a loop until some task is complete, calling tools as it goes along. And where this has really taken off, I think, has been in the software development world. Of course, like anything, adoption is very uneven and lumpy here. And you speak to 10 different software developers, you'll probably get very different thoughts, opinions, arguments about their use and their thoughts on the use of AI. But I think in broad strokes, we've seen this kind of like evolution from like 2022 or so on, when initially with some of the coding models that we had at the time, like the original codex, we start to see things like people making use of autocomplete in software development IDE tools. And, many of us even started experimenting with using IDEs for semantic ontology development and taking advantage of the kind of IDE completion there. But yeah, ultimately autocomplete is not really such a big deal at the end of the day. We then start to see an evolution going from that to more kind of like full-fledged tasks with ChatGPT, but with a lot of copy-paste back and forth between the IDE and ChatGPT, which is fine, but a little bit clunky and inefficient. And what we're seeing now is people adopting a lot of these agentic AI coding tools that just obviate the need for a lot of this copy-paste back and forth. And if you watch many software developers now, you'll see they might be using a tool like Claude Code or Gemini CLI. To me, these tools are kind of like wonderfully, they're both hyper new, but wonderfully old school as well, in that they basically give you a terminal interface like it's a 1980s term, interface or something like that. And you basically kind of like interact and have the agent kind of like build up the program that way. And so, like many of the things that came out of software engineering, those of us in semantic engineering have kind of looked over the wall and said, that looks kind of good. Can we have some of that? Can we adopt some of your best practice there? So this is something that I've been calling the the semantic coding agent pattern. And the basic idea is that we take some of these coding agent tools like Claude Code that, if you look at what it says on the tin, it's a coding tool, but really Claude Code is more of a universal agent and text editing tool. And many of us manage our semantic artifacts like schemas, like ontologies, like even whole knowledge bases, essentially as kind of like files that are managed in GitHub, just as we manage software programs as well. So we thought, why can't we use Claude Code to, in combination with an ontology development environment like Protege, to develop ontologies the same way that software developers are now writing code in the same way, using some of the same patterns. And what is nice about this is that we have already developed a number of tools for ontology development, particularly in the realm of ontology validation, verification, making use of OWL reasoners, making use of custom Sparkle queries that validate the contents of an ontology, either according to global standards such as the Open Biomedical Ontology standards, or our own local standards for our own ontology. We may have individual naming conventions or whatever, and many of us have set up custom Sparkle checks using tools like Robot in order to kind of like validate the ontologies. And what is really nice is that these coding tools can just make use of these tools right off the bat with just a little bit of simple kind of instruction tuning. That's all it takes. You don't even need to use something fancy like the Model Context Protocol here. They can just make use of these tools because they all have excellent command line interfaces already. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the tools or our evaluation of them, but I just want to give some kind of pointers to where you can kind of find out more about what we're doing. So a lot of what we are doing here, we're kind of putting into kind of like both a software stack, but really more a set of reusable patterns and documentation. And this is all under the umbrella of the AI for Curation org. So you can find information. I think the URL is now just aiforcuration.io. And we've created a little knowledge base in the form of some documentation that is kind of growing and evolving. And it's got instructions here that are aimed at different audiences. We've got some instructions here that are aimed at non-technical semantic curators, and we've got some instructions that are aimed at more technical people who want to set up the infrastructure for a particular ontology or knowledge base. And we've got some how-to guides and so on in there. But what this boils down to at the end of the day is we give people a kind of agentic setup, and we have like a copier template. If people are familiar with things like tools like Cookie Cutter, same kind of idea. You can basically just run this script and it will drop in many of the different pieces that you need into an existing GitHub repo. And those pieces include things that you might have had already. So things like, OWL files that historically might have been edited by humans using tools like Protege. We also plop in there, some instructions for the agents. This is something like an agents.md file. And we provide you with a kind of oboe standard one at the bat, but then you can customize that yourself. We also give some kind of like sub-agents that are specialized for doing individual tools. And most of these sub-agents, they really just take the form of textual instructions, as well as some scripts for kind of like hooks and MCPs. And this is designed to be run on top of an existing ODK environment, which will give you kind of like a Docker container with many of these tools running off the bat. And this is evolving all the time. We've started making use of things like Claude Code skills as well to help you do this. And so some of our more advanced users are just sitting there using Claude Code to edit the ontologies now, maybe using Protege to check the results. But what we found to be kind of quite nice is also adding GitHub integrations as well. And what this means is that people can come to our GitHub repos. And I should also mention that, for those of you not familiar with the general kind of like oboe paradigm, is that we have we've strongly encouraged, yeah, and I think this is true in environmental sciences as well with ontologies like Suite, but we've strongly encouraged, yeah, moving the source for different semantic artifacts into GitHub repos, having a kind of culture of anyone able to come in and make issue requests, having all changes go through pull requests to get validated by standard checks and so on. So, I think that kind of methodology has kind of spread kind of quite nicely. So a lot of people are familiar with this. And the nice thing is you can just really drop AI into this kind of workflow already. So here's an example for an anatomy ontology where the users come in and they've done a lot of the work up front here. They've done their research and they say, I want this new term that's missing from the ontology. Here's where I think it should go in the ontology, and here's some provenance for the definition from Wikipedia or wherever. And for this kind of task where the curator has already done a lot of the upfront research, the agent, in this case it's a simple copilot agent, tends to do a really good job of just adding the term, provided you've given it sufficient instructions on the best practices for your ontology. And so it gives you a nice summary of the changes that it's done. So it said, I've added your term, this is its ID, this is the definition. And, to be honest, this is quite a trivial use case because the AI is really simply copying and reformatting what was provided by the user here. And it can also similarly handle with ease many other kinds of cases, such as changing edges in knowledge graphs or changing kind of like relationships in some of our existing ontologies as well. But what is actually kind of quite powerful as well is the system is not limited to doing these kind of simple one term at a time changes. We can also have the agent go off and do its own research on some topics. So this example here is a term from our disease ontology Mondo. This is, again, sorry for the OBO format. Again, this is very common in the biosciences, but you may be not familiar with it, but it's pretty straightforward. It's just this tag value format. And what I've done here is I've highlighted this existing term, alpha-gal syndrome, which is a disease that has come to prominence lately. It's a tick-borne disease that if you get this, then you become allergic to meat and dairy for the rest of your life. And so, this is kind of sweeping across the eastern US. So I noticed that the representation we had in our ontology was quite out of date. It was last updated in 2018. There was a lot of things that were missing from it. And rather than me tell it, kind of like, I think you should make changes X, Y, and Z to the ontology, I just instructed the agent to go off, do some research on this topic, and come back with a kind of comprehensive plan of how to improve this representation in the ontology. And this is the plan it came back with, and it identified existing problems. And these are a range of problems, from biological problems about how the disease was defined through to more administrative problems, the fact that we were using URLs as provenance for the definition that came from the CDC, but like many CDC URLs, unfortunately, for various reasons, these are now broken. And there was also just a lot of missing information. So the agent went off, and what you don't quite see because it's a little bit truncated here, but is it actually went and did a bit of a literature review as well, and it found some recent PubMed articles about this disease that was able to recommend what to do. So, based on this, we also said, I wonder if there's other cases in the ontology where we have CDC URLs that are broken. We might want to fix these. And this is a really important task because we want to have up-to-date provenance, but normally this would have been quite a time-consuming, tedious task, not something that could be entirely automated, because there's no one script you can run to make the URLs work. You have to kind of like explore the URLs and make sure the content makes sense, do a bit of research to find replacement URLs. So we just tasked the agent with this, and it went off and it came up with, I think, what was a very good plan and a pull request for being able to fix these, where in some cases it was a straightforward redirect where we were able to just use the redirect URL, but in other cases it went off and found new replacement URLs as well. So this is just to give you an idea of the range of tasks that it can handle. So one area we're actively working on still is guardrails for the agents. So we do have this issue that even with agentic AI, where it is making use of tools and it's not tends not to hallucinate so wildly identifiers. It will generally get back identifiers from tools that it uses, but in many cases, it will still, if the shape of the problem is in such a way, it may still tend to hallucinate some of these IDs. So in this case, it essentially invented a PubMed Central ID, um, and we're currently working on some tools and patterns that can help mitigate against this kind of like hallucination error. And we've come up with something called like the anti-hallucination checksum pattern. And the basic idea here is that you never have the AI kind of come back just with bare identifiers, especially opaque identifiers like ontology term IDs or PubMed IDs. You always ask it for some kind of like tuple, and this might be a tuple of the ID and the label. And this essentially serves as a checksum because for it to get a hallucination by you, it's essentially got to come up with a consistent hallucination, which is far less likely. So we're kind of, this pattern seems to work well, and we're kind of currently just building this into our existing tool chains to have these checksums in place, such that they are used and can prevent the agent from going off and making these kinds of errors. So we're currently deploying these semantic agents over a number of different kinds of semantic artifacts. We have a growing number of OBO ontologies that have adopted this. So these include ontologies I work on, like Uberon and the gene ontology, as well as other ones like the EFO, the experimental factor ontology. In addition to these ontologies, there's also kind of LinkML semantic schemas that we're using it on. It seems to work really well for using for LinkML schemas. That's partly because of a lot of the mechanisms that we've built around LinkML for validation of schemas and so on, validation against data sets. So we've deployed this in a number of places. We've got a knowledge graph registry that's using it, and we're also using it for just general kind of annotation and knowledge graph construction as well. And so this list is kind of growing all the time. The way we see it is that agentic AI can really help us power the ontology development, but we don't see this as agents replacing the need for humans in this infrastructure. We see it as a collaboration between agents and humans, with the agents really working as co-semantic curators, and us kind of like leveraging existing social coding frameworks like GitHub, which allow humans to work together, and really just kind of extending that paradigm and having kind of a framework for agents and humans to work together on this. So I have some other slides later on we can go into just where we talk more about some of the kind of like the evals that we do and so on. But I just wanted to kind of like switch track just for kind of a couple of slides to talk about something that might be a bit of a change in tack, but quite relevant for this audience here. And this is a separate project we have here at Berkeley Lab. And one of the things driving us here is that we want to make use of multi-scale biological and environmental data to help us drive a number of simulations we have. And these include things like land system simulations. We have one called at the lab called EcoSim, which is a land system model with about 1,000 different variables, where it kind of like models the interaction between these variables on like hundreds of thousands of lines of Fortran code. We also have a number of different experimental systems where we are kind of like probing environments both at the deep molecular level, everything from kind of like cryo-EM, kind of like scanning through right the way through to genomics and kind of understanding plant growth, plant growth chambers, all the way through to kind of like site measurements. We have kind of experimental warming sites where we look at the effect of nitrogen pooling based on how much a site is altered or warmed in some ways. So we want some kind of framework in which we can take this diverse multi-scale data, bring it together, and not only integrate it, but start using it in the context of these simulations and land system models. So one approach that we took here was we said, okay, the first thing is we want these different simulations to work well together, and we want the simulations to work with a lot of the biological and environmental data we have, many of which use different vocabularies. So we thought, okay, why don't we start by taking this existing land system model and its 100,000 lines of Fortran code, which, as I see it, essentially has its own implicit internal ontology. It already knows in some sense about dissolved organic carbon and aqueous potassium diffusivity and the relationships between them, albeit encoded in, kind of old school Fortran. So what we did is we used agents to essentially extract that implicit ontology from those simulation frameworks, use that we built kind of like robot templates to kind of essentially build an ontology from this. We used some of our standard ontology tooling to decompose some of these complex concepts like aqueous potassium diffusivity into the underlying concepts. So, this can be broken down into concepts that make use of other ontologies like the environment ontology or the chemistry ontology, CHEBI, for concepts like potassium or bodies of water or plant growth or soil and so on. So this is all in an ontology we call BERVO, the Biological and Environmental Research Variable ontology, that is available now in BioPortal. Sorry, we should really put this in EcoPortal as well, but just in a lot of my day-to-day work, I use my BioPortal more commonly, so that's where it exists at the moment. But it's also available on GitHub if you want to use that. And the way we're starting to use this is part of something that we're thinking of as the EcoSim co-scientist. And the basic idea here is that right now it takes a lot of our scientists a lot of time and effort to research the literature, to find experimental data sets, download supplementary data files, which are in all kinds of formats, and then essentially normalize all of that and turn it into what are called netcdf files. I'm sure many of you on this call are probably quite familiar with like netcdf and that kind of thing, but what we also need to do is like normalize the variables that are used in these netcdf files such that they make use of our standard ontology such that they could all be used in this simulation. And so we're not quite there yet, but we had a hackathon last week where we made some progress towards this general EcoSim co-scientist, basically just using Claude Code as our agentic environment at the moment. And so, the basic idea here is you can come in and say, okay, I'm interested in building up, doing a kind of like a meta-analysis of different experimental warming, nitrogen cycle data sets. So it was able to kind of like come up with a plan where it found some publications of relevance, downloaded the supplementary data, and kind of came up with a plan for extracting these into netcdf files, all the while being kind of quite nice and transparent about the methodology that it's using here, the kind of variables it thinks are relevant, and using also going to some kind of like existing databases like the FAO soils database and using this to really pull all these data sets together to make these conjoined netcdf files. So with that, just a little teaser on some of the work that we're doing at the moment. And sorry, I didn't have any slides. I mentioned, Kogan, that we might talk about the alpha Earth embeddings, but we didn't have quite time for that today. But I just want to thank the many people involved in testing, being guinea pigs for testing a lot of the agentic frameworks that we've developed and have been deploying over a number of different ontologies and other semantic artifacts so far. So thanks to all of those people, and hopefully that was about the right amount of time, so we can have some questions if there are any.